Okay, welcome to episode 106 of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm delighted to be speaking to Nick Duffell again. Nick is a psychotherapist and trainer in private practice who pioneered therapeutic work with ex-boarders and specialist training for psychotherapists. He is the author of The Making of Them, Trauma, Abandonment and Privilege, and Wounded Leaders, among other books. Welcome, Nick.
Oh, thank you for having me back, Piers. It's great.
Yeah, I think it's been possibly 3 years since we last spoke and almost 100 podcasts since.
Wow, well done you.
Yeah, I didn't think when I set out that it would keep on, but I'm just so passionate and I love having conversations, even though I'm an introvert and I prefer to hide away. But it's like I just learn so much.
Hmm.
So, so I'd love today for us to talk a little bit about the importance of communities, kind of meeting people, and some of the work that you're doing around, group work. Because often, as ex-boarders or people who've been through trauma, it's often one-to-one work. So I'd love for us to talk a bit about what's the place of group work.
Yeah, well, the thing about group work is that it's sort of exponentially powerful in that you get if you get the sort of right sort of number of people in the room who've got common things they're willing to open up about or on the point of open up about it, you can get transformational stuff going on in people at speed, really, because the power of being in a group is something really quite extraordinary. And uh, I've learned a lot from doing these boarding school survivors workshops over the years. We started them in 1990.
Wow.
It came out of an initiative which was men's group work. So it started out just for men in the beginning, and then we ran a few years, and we had then a lot of letters from women say, "Hey, what about us?" And then we started tentatively to run women's work, and now we've got some highly trained women doing this work. Uh, at the moment, led by Ruth, who I believe is going to come and speak to you
Mm.
soon. And what happens in these groups is that people who have been sort of shy or ashamed about coming out to talk about the problems of having been a boarder as a child, um, uh, come into a group where there's a bunch of other people who are dealing with similar stuff, and everyone's got individual stories. But the thing about those boarding schools, which were formed in the late Victorian age, they were designed to turn out a particular kind of person. So everybody's experienced something rather similar, and they've probably never talked about it, and they've certainly never talked about it in depth before, and they've certainly never talked about it with people who are keen to hear, look, what happened to you? Because something happened to me there. Some people know what happened to them, other people don't quite know how it affected them. Some of the men have been basically sent there by their wives to, begin to sort of open up and become more emotionally available. And things happen, things pop. One person says something and that triggers somebody else. And the workshops that we're doing, we run them to we've got quite a strict plan, and we run them over 4 days. And we do the first 2 days a weekend, and then about 6 weeks in which we allow that the work that's been done on the first weekend to, as it were, cook inside of the person.
Mhm.
And then we bring them back for a second weekend. Now, the first weekend, you've got an opportunity really to tell your story, to tell what happened to you, to listen to others, and very importantly, to sort of reconnect to the child you were, who was sent away, because most likely you've also done a bit of sending away internally of your own child. And so that is very beautiful and powerful connection. And one of the ways we assist that program, we get people to bring a photograph of the child they were just before they went. away to school for the first time, and they've been looking at that photo perhaps a few weeks before they came. So people are really in a ready state. And the other thing is that we've got two highly trained, skilled psychotherapists as facilitators. So these people are very well held because lots of feelings come up. You know, sometimes sometimes sadness, sometimes anger at the treatment of the authorities there, or for mum and dad for sending them away. Sometimes envy of people who are more emotionally connected than they are. And if you are able to sort of choreograph that emotional work with people in a good way, it helps the whole group, and the thing becomes a sort of a vehicle of power, really.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's the first weekend. Now the second weekend after this is cooked for a bit, and if people are, if they're in sort of if they're getting support in one-to-one therapy as well, that's great to support them through the process. Um, the second weekend, we're looking at much more what we call how to move from survival to living.
Mm.
Because I know we talked about this before, and maybe you can speak more, but every child has to survive boarding, and they survive it by doing some level of adaptation of the selves and getting up behavior patterns. And when you learn that very long, you go on doing it through the rest of your life. So people are still, in a way, surviving in their families, in their intimate relationships, at work, and stuff like that. So we offer a sort of toolkit for recognizing these survival patterns, and we get people to work on them in the room, and how to actually let go of the grip of these survival patterns. Because these are survival patterns that were invented by a child to keep us safe. And it doesn't work, if you're a man of 40 or 50 and you're still surviving, you know, when your girlfriend or your wife calls out and you think, oh my God, what have I done? Am I in trouble? And you go into kind of survival panic mode. Uh, so we we're really trying to assist them on that second weekend, by which time, you see, they've got confidence of the group
Yeah.
and the other people. Let's say there's a dozen or so people in the room. They've got the trust of them, because the first weekend people don't know. They think, some people come in thinking, "Oh my God, the last thing in the world I want to do is be in a room full of ex-border men."
I've heard so many people who have purposefully kept away from all ex-boarders, men and women,
Yeah,
all
you're
their
right.
life. And to be in a room full of ex-boarders, like,
Yeah,
ah.
I know. I know. So we expect that, and we're waiting for that. And we've got lots of ways of working with this so that people become safe and relaxed, and they can learn to listen to other people and learn to follow. Sometimes they get sparked by somebody, and something comes up, and it's an unknown process. So they're guided through that. And so by the end of the first weekend, usually the group is quite a tight unit. And so, and that's ready for the second weekend, where, in a way, the work is harder for the participant, because you really have to work on your own survival strategies. And you know, you have to, in a way, thank the child who made them and say to the child, I'm here now. You don't need to do this anymore. And it's quite difficult. So that's what we're supporting them through.
Mm. When did you first, thank you. When did you first get the idea to do these, Nick? How did it come to you?
Oh, I got it in the late 80s. I was just I think in 1987, 88, I was doing it.
I was year two of boarding school at that time.
I was just, I was just training as a psychotherapist, and I was assisting on a men's group, because it was the big era of what we used to call the men's movement. I realized there were some guys in the room who needed something a little bit different from what we were offering. And what they all had in common was a certain kind of woundedness, They were a bit rebellious against the establishment. And they'd all been to boarding school. And hey, presto, guess who's the same? It was me. That's who I was too. So I really, it's the first time I really started thinking about it in a psychological way. But 20 years before that, I'd been in India and I was astonished. I was teaching in a boarding school for a bit, and I was astonished how the Indians were sort of so kind to me. And I knew a bit of the history of the Raj. And I kind of I wondered what we'd done to them. Had we somehow made them somehow psychologically inferior? And so when I began to look at this um, thing, and just while I was sort of inventing the workshops, I realized, yes, that there's something happens at these boarding schools where you get to be the one who makes everyone else feel psychologically inferior. And the way you get to do it is you have to learn it yourself. So you learn it through a tremendous hierarchy of, people who've been there longer than you, and people who are prefects, and people who can beat you, and ridiculous sort of getting into trouble because you walked across that green, or you didn't have your buttons done up, or some sort of nonsense like this. Yeah, which you could really seriously get into trouble. And that's so I was working on trying to produce a workshop because I believed in group work, men's group work at the time, and I was beginning to see clients, and I saw one guy who was a high flyer, a lawyer who lost his voice, and he came to therapy. He was making presentations, found he couldn't speak, and something had happened to him, and we sort of unpacked his life, and he was the one who really taught me about boarding school. He said I became strategic, and I've been strategic all my life, and it's worked, but now it's all falling to bits. And so that's where I came up with the concept of the strategic survival personality. And I realized all children have to make that. And it doesn't matter whether you've been to a school where where things awful didn't happen to you. The thing is, you were separated from your parents. You had to get on your own, and you were incarcerated in one of these institutions. And then for some people, they were abused on top of that. But it's even just without the abuse, you had to survive it. And what I sort of began to dawn on me as I was thinking about these workshops was the fact that the solution to the problem then was to be a survivor. But in adult life, this solution has now become the problem in your life. And sort of when you get down to it, once people have talked through what happened to them, have been heard and validated and seen and listened to, which is what we do in the first part of these workshops. And you've been, very busy doing in all your podcasts, really validating people about this. Then the next thing is, how do I get free from the shackles of what I had to do to survive it in a way? And I tried to put this in very simple terminology. How do I stop surviving and start living?
Yes.
Or
Yeah.
you could say, how do I become my true self? Because I've become an adapted self. But, you know, I really say the simpler the better. How do I stop this surviving? Because at any moment, I've got a default mechanism to survive. That's built in from the child who constructed this. And that child did it quite well because those atmospheres are brutal. And it's not just the masters and the rules, it's the other children too. Because no one wants to see you cry there, or because they're afraid everyone's going to start crying. So the first thing you do is you shut down on your emotions and you make a workable survival personality.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that is really the worst equipment, the worst training for family life, for being in a couple,
Mhm. Being a
into
leader, as you write in Wounded
being a
Leaders.
modern leader. It's okay if you want to go into some institution, you want to join the army, and church, or it used to be business or something like that, or go back into some institutional life. That works okay. You know the ropes. But for anything where you have to be in contact emotionally with people, and be real and have empathy for them and deal with vulnerabilities, it's rubbish.
Mhm.
So the thing goes in the following way. Have your story heard, reconnect to that child that you were,
Mhm.
because it's important, because you've disowned that child in a way. You sent him away now. Originally it was your parents sent him away. Now you've sent him away. So
Mhm.
you need to bring him back from school, because that's part of your innocence.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you want that back in your life, not you always be suspicious and surviving. And when you're in a group of, say you're a group of a dozen guys who are all actually got it and are trying to do that, this is a very powerful field.
Mhm.
This is really gonna pull a lever to get you going on that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Because um yeah, so then the survival personality has to be jettisoned. Then that's difficult. you know
What do you mean by Genescent?
Jettisoned. It has to be
Yeah.
got rid of. You have to
Mhm.
stop living out of your survival personality. And the thing is, it was designed by a child, so it's got lots of sort of pseudo adult bits into it. It's a bit, it's like one of the things you learn to do at boarding school is you learn to talk the talk, and you learn that very early, because you get rid of your regional accent. You talk sort of like you sort of you adultify yourself very early on, and everybody's wanting you to do that. Your parents are pleased when you come home and you sound like you're clever and polite, and and the schools are training you to be little gentlemen, blah blah blah. But actually, there's an emotional self that you actually have kicked out.
Mhm. 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 I remember my parents telling me off, or my mother, because whenever she used to ask me, well, what do you think about that? And I said, it's all right. And she's like, why do you always say all right? Can't you bring some more emotion to it? I'm like, sorry. But it's being drained out of me, but I didn't know then.
Yeah. And sometimes on the workshop, you see people who will do some kind of connection to the child they were, and they'll weep. And there's other people in the room and say, "My God, why can't I do that?" Yeah.
Mm.
And these are things they've been struggling with all their life. So someone may say, someone who's got to know them just a little bit already, and that they're facilitated, may say, well, maybe there's very good reason why you disconnected from these emotions.
Yeah.
And they maybe never thought about it like that. And then they're witnessed, you see, they're witnessed, and they got another dozen other people actually following this story, and this attempt to reconnect parts of themselves. It's very, very, very poignant, this sort of work, when you're trying to come back to it.
Mm. It's almost like dominoes. It's like once one domino goes over, then the next person goes, wow, I'm seeing myself in them, and I'd forgotten about
Yeah,
that.
it can be like that. You're right. Yeah.
And then I was just talking to a lady who's worked in prisons, who said doing paintings, and saying this first guy, he drew a picture, and on it he brought it up and he says, "This is me burning in hell," and he started weeping, and all the other men, all maximum security prisons came and put their hands on him. They started weeping as well, including the prison guard.
How beautiful. Yeah.
And it's like that domino,
Yeah.
one after the
Yeah.
other, that
That's
when we are vulnerable enough
that's right.
about
That's
our
right. Yeah.
emotions.
That's right. You get people in the workshop, they didn't know they had that gear in them,
Mhm.
either to weep like that or to reach out to another person.
Mm, mm,
So they discover parts of themselves.
mm.
And and we're witnessing this, and we're saying, yeah, you always had that. You just had to shut it away.
Yes. Yeah.
You just had to close it down in order to survive.
What's the importance of being seen? One, as a young boy or girl, when we go to these schools, we're not seen. How can you be seen if you've got one housemaster for 50 boys or 50 girls? Then in the workshops or when we're doing group work, suddenly they're seeing me, but they're not judging me. Often when we were seen in the boarding school environment, it was, you're crying. Remember the first time I cried after about 3 weeks? Everyone in the dormitory, no doors, they all jumped into my cubicle, started laughing at me, going, Croft, he's not so strong now. I'm like, I will never cry again.
Oh, wow.
So, what's the importance of being seen in a positive way?
Well, the first thing is, when you're growing up in a family, which is this is the design process of human beings. Uh, that we're hoping to grow up, spend all our time with mom and dad and siblings and grannies and pets and all the other things that go along with a family life. And what growing up is actually it's going through a whole bunch of developmental processes, yeah, to bring you to become uh, an adult who realizes life is an interdependent experience of both being powerful and vulnerable, not one or the other. Yeah. And, being a sexual adult, not having anybody having intrude on you and stuff like this. So this is you're very, very vulnerable and sensitive during these development processes, both as a small child at 8 or something, but also as a puberty boy of 13, 14, very, very vulnerable. Because what's happening to you? So you need people around you who are there to witness what's happened and to care for you and to make you feel that you're special, that you mean something to somebody. And even at moments when you're growing up and you're feeling bewildered, that you're still special to your mom, for example, and stuff like that. Now, this process is completely interrupted when you're sent away to an institution because, you know, kids can't figure out why they're sent away anyway. Because when they're young, the kids think, well, I know it's meant to be good, but I don't actually. It's pretty difficult, and I'm supposed to enjoy it. They told me how to enjoy it. There must be something wrong with me. I don't, and I better not tell them because they know it's cost a shed load of money. Blah blah blah. So they don't talk about it, and they go into shame. And you get people on the workshops who haven't opened up about it since that point. Actually, sometimes, yeah. And so just as you say, so you've got a housemaster and maybe his wife caring for 50, 60 boys or girls, and similar in girls' schools, same kind of dynamics. And there's no way they can be real witnesses to what's going on. There's no way they could be caring. And these days they can't even put their arm around a kid, because we're all so paranoid about safeguarding and all this sort of stuff. And so kids having to do it all on its own, nobody's saying, no way can they be special. I mean, being special is sort of looked at as really quite a crime in in institutional environment. Oh, you're just showing off, you're just doing it for attention, you're just trying to make a fool out of me or something. So that whole natural process is interrupted. And then the child is only really witnessed by the peer group. And the child growing up and doing sexual development through puberty, learning stuff from the peer group, getting mirrored from the peer group. And that means you get mirrored and witnessed and seen by somebody who's A, in competition with you, B, doesn't care about you, and doesn't know what it is that they're seeing because they're similarly ignorant. So actually, the kind of uh, long-term developmental education you get in a place like that is extremely poor. You may come out quite good at history at Latin because you've had 5.5 days in classes where there's only 14 other children or something rather than 30. And you may be good at squash and cricket or whatever. But actually, are these the real things that mattered, that things that mattered actually to our ancestors? You have had a very, very poor upbringing.
They mattered to, as you say in that Guardian article in 2014, is, the importance of emotional intelligence in decision making. We can't make good decisions without emotional information.
Well,
And
that's the other thing. That's the other thing. There's a whole sort of thought form that these schools have got is that a bit of hardship is going to make you resilient, and that um, you can train someone to be a leader by giving them lots of experience of hierarchical situations. And they don't hold up water, they don't hold up to any kind of intellectual inquiry whatsoever. And this is not, I'm not talking about sort of new age principles or anything. It's just very basic principles. We now know that in order to develop resilience, you need to have good attachments.
yes.
In order to make good decisions, you need to have access to your emotions. And your emotions are, uh, when you've got emotional intelligence, when you're connected to your emotions, you can also construct a value system which gives you guidance in unknown situations. And we know this from very basic things like psychometric testing for pilots. They did a study in Sweden. They developed these psychometric testing, and they to see how people would react to unknown fast response situations. And a lady called Olya Kalali did thousands of these tests as a corporate psychologist working for headhunting firms, trying to find the best corporate leaders. And she contacted me some years ago. She said, I've just been reviewing a lifetime career of these things. And what I've discovered is that if I sort them through whether they went to boarding school or not, the boarding school survivors have all done extremely poorly.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. And she says, do you think this because they were not connected to their emotions? And I said, this, in sort of, we talked about this at length, and she then wrote an article about it. Um, and she wrote an article about how she thought from her studies, you could understand why so many bad decisions were being made in the lead up to Brexit.
Mhm.
Uh, because of people running on their strategic survival personalities in terms of my hypothesis, yeah,
Mhm.
uh, having to disconnect from their emotions, so then actually not having somewhere to go to get rapid response, good decision making. And Olia's findings were really incredible. And she wasn't even looking for that, you see. Um, and so that actually the training for leadership wasn't actually a good one. The success of the boarding school system is that it did turn out a whole bunch of people who appeared rather similar, who spoke rather similar, and had cut off from their families and their mums and dads, and had reattached in a way to the values of school, class, nation, who were, good Brits to serve the empire. And so, and on the workshop, when we do a workshop, we get some people who actually have been on that kind of journey themselves. We get other people who've been complete rebels out in, rejecting every form of authority going, and people, in between. And actually, when they come together and really talk about stuff, they realize that, that whole training they had has uh, affected like almost every aspect of their lives.
Mhm. Yeah, I had this hypothesis a few years ago. This idea that when we're in boarding school, if we've gone 7, 8, 11, we are surrounded, instead of by our parents or by our friends' parents, we're surrounded by children. So instead of up until 18, it's almost like internally, Robert Moore in his work talks about this inner cup that we sculpt. And I almost feel that when we're at home, we fill up with the father, the feminine, the masculine, the feminine, and we get through being securely attached what a man is, what the female is. But when we're at boarding school, who are our image makers, like you said, our peer groups,
Yeah,
they're the same age as us, all
yeah,
1 year
that's right.
above us.
That's right.
2 years above us won't talk to us unless they need us to do some fagging.
Yeah.
So it's like you don't want to speak to them because then it might be you try and keep away from them. So I just think that's, I feel we're kind of empty. We've got to fill ourselves up again with, well, what is a mature man? What is a mature woman?
Well, you make a very good point because the schools are really busy about saying that you learn to be in community. But if I go from what you just said now, which fits my own view, is that these are not communities, these places. These are institutions. They're not communities. Communities of people of all different ages and all different genders and all different, you know, um, it's like a village, it takes a village to raise a child, they say. Yeah, that's right. And institutions can't do it. Institutions can raise institutionalized persons. And um, the most of us, also went to single gender, single sex institutions. Sometimes some of the schools were were not that. Some of the schools had some of the boys' schools had a handful of girls' schools. There was some genuinely uh, co-educational schools. But we've just done we're in the process of doing a book that's just been submitted to Routledge with chapters from a whole bunch of people who've trained with me and have pursued their own interests in this boarding school thing. And so, they have written and researched some of these topics. And there's some very, very interesting things coming out. Like, for example, what happens to siblings. So just like you said, you can have a sibling sent to a boarding school who loses touch with the other sibling, and you get stories like, well, that sibling is behaving badly or is not settled at school, so they send then the younger sibling, younger brother or sister out there, and then because they're like you say 2 years above them, then they don't talk to their brother or sister, and it sort of blows their siblinghood apart.
That's what Harry said in his book, Spare. He said that when he got to Eton, William went up to him and says, "You don't speak to me.
Oh, right. Oh,
They've
so
just lost your mum."
didn't know that.
It's a couple of 6 months
Oh,
later. He arrives at Eton and his brother says, "You don't talk to me.
it's
I
not the
don't know
fault
you."
of those kids. Those institutions and the traditions are so powerful. I mean, they're really powerful. That's why we do the workshops in some ways. We got to set up something as powerful as what people have been through.
Mm. So coming back to being seen, we say they weren't seen at school. What's the importance then in workshops, in group work, one-to-one work of being seen?
It's hugely important. And uh, you know, the boost you get by being seen by both So let's take the workshops to start with. A bunch of your peers, because in some ways it's like your peers, although we've got all different ages comes to these groups. We had people in their 70s, we had people in their 20s, you know, and we've got a big cross section around 40s and 50s. Yeah. But you're in, let's say, in a group with this varying age group, and it really works. It's very strange. You think it wouldn't work, but it does because they've all come around a common woundedness, a
Mm.
wound that they've experienced, and they all recognize each other's wound, and they see, yes, you've got this wound, I got it too. I, as someone wounded, see you. Yeah. And
Mm.
I'm willing to listen to your story. I want to hear how it affected you, and then I'll give you the respect to hear you, and then you can listen to mine, and we'll mutually witness each other, and everyone else will see that. And then, of course, the staff, who like we're not really teachers and we're not really parents, but sometimes we're seen a bit like that. So sometimes people get pissed off with us because they had bad teachers all the time. We have to deal with that. I have to train people to deal with that. Yeah. And so then because you've got the peer group really witness them in a new way, in a deeply emotional way, and then you've got the parents, stroke teachers, stroke workshop facilitators witnessing you, validating you, and choreographing the whole. It's very powerful and effective. You can't do that in individual work so well. It happens over time when you build a relationship with this person and they remember your story. That's beautiful too.
Mm.
Um, but this kind of really gets inside your cells when it's happening at that sort of that the group level. Because and I mean, I did it in groups from the beginning, Piers, because I thought to myself, look, we all got damaged in these groups. We all had to survive in groups. And what I've seen a lot, I'd already seen a couple of years of men's work, and actually I saw that groups are quite good for men, right? In a way, somewhat better than one-to-one groups for men, but it's a whole nother story. But I thought to myself, is it possible that if the damage is done in a group, then the healing can be done in a group? Because in a way, it's the same sort of channel that you experience. And we've been running them since 1990. It's 2024. We're still going, and I haven't changed that much. I mean,
Wow.
they
34
changed a bit,
years.
but
But,
it worked, you see.
mm, bless
And
you
it
for
worked.
doing this work and keeping on with it. Really, thank you.
Yeah. No, it's a privilege for me to do it. And it's also a privilege now. People are picking up on it because in the beginning, I was like this kind of lone nutcase. And a few people were interested, but not many. So
Mm. Mm.
and I'm handing it on because I can't do it. I'm too old. I can't do all this stuff myself. So I'm training people, and where the workshops are going on, and they'll develop as long as there's a need for it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Think there is. I mean, I've been running a men's circle now for 4 or 5 years online. I started it during COVID, and it began just as a regular men's circle and then began just to be boarding school. And the power of that circle has been for me
I am
less so much that when someone shares, it's more the person who's listening
Oh
because it's that, oh my God, I'm not alone. Oh my God, it's just been in my head regurgitating because, as George Orwell says in one of his books, he says, one of the cardinal sins was to speak up.
yeah,
You don't grasp, and therefore we keep it all inside. So when
good.
someone else shares, you're like, oh my God, I'm
Yeah,
not alone. And then
yeah,
someone else, and it just builds this almost zeitgeist that I've just found that so,
yeah.
so powerful. And that being seen, that being heard, and yeah, the touch as well. It's obviously less on the Zoom groups, but one to one, you're actually in that space with
Yeah,
someone.
yeah. Well, I mean, sometimes we'll do on the workshops, we might do a little role play. We might get one of the participants to be an ideal parent for a moment for one of the participants, and that's very powerful. And and then we do use physicality, and sometimes I know Ruth does a lot with a punch bag in the women to get them to actually get some of their anger out about stuff, and that's fantastic as well.
Mm.
You know?
Yeah.
In some ways, for men, it's the opposite direction. It's more opening up the heart and weeping and holding each other and stuff seems more appropriate.
Mm. Love that
Uh,
what you said about touch and the absence of touch. I did a video last week about touch and violence. There was a paper in the 60s talking about the guy did a research across the world showing that the societies with the most violence were those with the least amount of touch in childhood.
yeah, I believe it.
And like, of course,
Yeah.
and if I think of, you know, the last three or four foreign ministers have all been ex-boarders. I think David Lammy, foreign minister now, he's an ex-boarder.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, 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 yeah. He's the only one in the front bench.
Is he? I
I
did.
did have a look through, and
I did.
yeah,
Yeah.
he went. And it's like that thing of, you know, the violence. It's like, oh, so fascinating. So I think one of the things I'd love to go back to is you mentioned about surviving, and then we could go on to living, but I begin with surviving. What is surviving for you? What do we do? That first weekend that you do, what does that look like? Because some of us might go, I have no idea. Am I
Yeah.
doing it?
Well, look, the first thing, survival is the prime human impulse. And we have got all kinds of um, equipment, mostly around our head and our face, our ears, our eyes, our nose, and everything, in order to sense whether an environment we're in is safe or not. And you think what like for an 8-year-old coming into one of those great big institutions with a chapel and one of those big wooden corridors with those big wooden boards with gold letters up with all the names of the house captains or whatever going back to about 1870. And all the child's sensory equipment are going, whoa, this isn't safe. Yeah. And it gets in a group of other kids who are similarly scared, and everyone is going, whoa, this isn't safe. I'm not saying that's a conscious process, that's going into the autonomic nervous system, and they're all start to get on red alert. Yeah. And they're running a lot of anxiety. And some people run an anxiety from the first day they go till the present day. They don't know they're running the anxiety because it becomes normal. They don't know, for example, that not having that feeling in your stomach is not normal. They don't know that having bad digestion is not normal because they're running a default survival mechanism already. That's I'm talking about it's happening really at a physical level. Yeah. At a psychological level, we're scanning all the time where you see what's the kind of person that I can be here, that I can be both safe, uh, which could be a kind of person who keeps their head down
Mm.
and complies, gets on with stuff, and what kind of person would get on well. So maybe I could be a star at rugby, or in a bit of a bit of a joker in the junior common room. Yeah, maybe because I'm built quite well, I can actually show how people tough are they are and bullied. And if I show how tough I am, uh, I'm going to be safe because they're not going to get me. So all this is running around safety. And then you've got an environment which is structured in a way that gives everybody more power over you the longer you've been there. And you've got an environment which has been there, let's say, what did I say before, since 1870,
Mhm.
and calls it customs and rules which you have to learn, memorize. And if you get anything wrong, you're in trouble. So this is a very, very stressful situation. And the whole goal of it is not to look like it's very stressful. You've got to look like this is good and normal. And
I'm fine.
yeah, and I can get on with that, and it's going to be, if I master this, House of Commons is going to be a breeze.
House of Commons looks just like the chapel I used to go to.
Yeah, it looks just like a public school chapel. And I want to come out a winner. And that's either by keeping my head down, be a complier, or become some kind of star, or be a super bully, or all kinds of things. So you so that impulse to get through and be safe is a completely, absolutely normal one. And then, depending on the conditions that you find and what you've got in you and who you are, what you've already learned, you might have a skill that you developed. Like Tim Brooke Taylor says he told a joke on the first day and he saw people laughed and relaxed and he thought, okay, I'm gonna tell jokes. And then he becomes a comedian. And so that survival instinct is there and it gets given plenty of form and contact by the structure of the school and the other people, and everybody's doing the same. And so you develop a sort of false personality, a false self, which is always surviving and is always looking out for trouble. And it's so well developed that you think that's who you are. But actually, you've just got a mask on. George Orwell talked about wearing a mask. You quoted him, so I bring him back.
Mhm.
He said this beautiful phrase: "He wears a mask, and the mask fits."
Mhm.
So
Did
you
you hear
don't know you're
what,
wearing it.
did you hear what Bowlby said about 1984?
Oh no!
It's in this book here. Bessel van der Kolk was speaking to him, and he said
Oh yeah,
1984 was based on his boarding school experiences.
yeah, sure.
It's like, wow, you know.
Yeah, so there you are. You're wearing a mask. You are your survival personality. And then one day you read an article in the Guardian that has some cranky psychotherapist says actually people who went to boarding school had to survive it and they develop a survival personality. You go, blimey, is that me? Am I wearing a mask?
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
Yeah. And and people start to realize, yeah, I've been wearing a survival mask, or I've been having to survive. And actually, I haven't really been living. I've just been getting through. And or I've been having very unsatisfactory relationships because part of my mask means not being genuinely emotional or not developing empathy for others.
mhm.
And how do I now start taking that off? And will there be anything underneath if I do? There's a lot of fear people have sometimes.
Mm. Fascinating. And what kind of comes to me is often, yeah, as you're saying that about the taking the mask off, I see that you have, say, the 5 or 10% who are the crush or had a difficult time. They often straight away realize boarding school's not a good thing. But then
Yeah.
you've got almost the 80% in the middle
Yeah.
who, oh, it wasn't too bad.
Yeah.
But as I've been researching Judith Herman's work in trauma and recovery and the idea of mirror neurons, that actually when you see someone being abused or beaten up, that's actually as traumatic for you because you're feeling that. So I'd love for you to talk about, often there's the 80% of ex-boarders who say, oh, it's fine. nothing really that bad happened. Although bad things were happening, nothing happened to me. I wasn't sexually abused. I'd love you to talk to that. That what do you say to someone who says, "Oh, it didn't do me any harm"?
Well, I'm not really in the business of challenging people who are very convinced that that is so, because what I know is that in 1989, when I came up with this word boarding school survivors, it was a very, very provocative word.
Mm.
It's meant to be like a slap in the face in a way. So you've been to these expensive schools and actually you just survived it. This is very confrontative. And we can forget that, once we've been deeply into the subject like you have, we could forget how provocative that was in the beginning. So I'm not going to confront anyone who hasn't yet recognized that they've been on survival mode from boarding school, because that's not my business. And the other thing is, I know I'm going to get quite a lot of aggro back. You can get quite a lot of hostility if you go around proselytizing about this thing, because these people are still on survival mode, right? And on the one hand, yeah, so they may still be sending their children, which I'm against. But on the other hand, there's always a possibility that survival personality it will fail, as it does very often in later life. Something will happen. They'll 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 get sacked, or some they'll have a child who becomes eight or something like this, and the psyche will respond. And I trust the psyche in human beings to respond. And so I'm not going to go in there with a crowbar.
No, yeah,
So um, the I can argue the case for survival and why it's so, but it have to people have to really want to know about it. Um, Otherwise, it's too confrontative for them.
mm, yeah,
So um, I don't I don't recommend taking people on in this way. I I do recommend spreading the good news that actually recovery is possible.
mm,
Uh, and um, I know they're going to be the biggest group in society because, of course, why wouldn't you want to keep your head down? Would you want to take on? Because if you take it on, you're not just taking on your school. In a way, you take on the whole British establishment, and it's pretty big. Um,
yeah,
I think it's much better when people realize that actually there's something happening in the quality of my relationships, not what it could be, or my wife or my children say I'm not there in a particular way, and I want to get to the better of this. And then there's their own motivation to come and explore it. But if we were to argue the thing intellectually amongst educators, I would say, hang on a minute, why are we still promoting something which is not supported by any single theory of child development I've ever heard of? This cannot be a good thing. You know, you take people away from their homes, little children away from their homes, put them in institutions, uh, and what house them sort of left brain, hyper rational knowledge, do you really imagine they're not actually going to have some psychological problems? It's actually a no brainer when you think about it. So, uh, at that intellectual, sort of educational, political level, I have no. Uh, no problem making a very, very strong case. I don't want to fight this out with every single survivor going. It's not worth it. When somebody pops, that's a real thing when they realize that it's cost them, and they'll do their own work or not.
mm,
But uh,
yeah.
otherwise, I'm not really going to go headlong into that.
Mm. Yeah, I've had that sometimes on my podcast or on my videos on YouTube, people really having a go at me and being really rude. And the beginning, I tried to argue. It's like it just got worse and worse, and so I just
Yeah,
deleted
that's why
it.
that's why I don't really like talk radio. I've been invited on talk radio a number of times, and because they want to make a balance. They want to have a few people speaking about that they didn't like it, a few
Mm.
that never did me any harm, sort of stuff. And you're in the middle of this, and you don't get a very deep conversation like that. You just get a dogfight, actually.
Mm. I went on. Was it not Talk TV? I got GB News. I think I went on
Oh,
last year, and I think Amelia went on about 6 months later. It's interesting. The person in the opposite camp was the same person each time. It was a because they said they couldn't find anyone else to be pro
Oh, I
broadcasting.
remember I used to go in the early days. I'd go, I was when it was really only the Beeb, I'd turn up at Broadcasting House to do something. And there was this headmaster that I used to drag out. And we actually got to, I rather like the guy, actually. We got to know each other. So in the waiting room, we got on terribly well. But then they had, then they'd have their dogfight during the interview.
Oh, amazing, amazing. So, kind of segueing into thriving, what does then the thriving look like? If that's the second weekend in the workshop,
Yeah, see, you develop this survival personality, and then you could say this, then the survival person got you and is running your life. And so the first stage is really recognizing this, acknowledging and accepting this, that I've been running my life by a survival personality. And whenever you do survival, there's a cost. And so part of the job is to say, well, what's the cost been? How has it cost me and those around me? Yeah. And what's the emotional cost? I'm not talking about the cost of the schooling. We all know that's a lot. But what's the emotional cost? And actually, is this cost I still want to go on paying for the rest of my life? And or do I want to move forward and really press a reset button in my life? So instead of being on this survival red alert, I start to take life in a more open way and a more relaxed way, a connected way, and a more emotional way. And actually, if I do that, it's a risk because you cannot guarantee that that's always safe. And then many people will say, well, I played it safe with the survival personality for a long time. It's about time I took some risk now. I'm ready for it. I'm ready for it because I've got support in my life, because I know I wasn't only one. And I'm not willing to lead a disconnected life anymore. So it's an act of will, really,
Mhm.
to go on this recovery journey. Yeah.
Interesting. Annabelle Gonzalez, a psychiatrist I spoke to last year, maybe the year before, works with complex trauma. And she said one of the keys for overcoming complex trauma is purposefully making mistakes. So she says, put the wrong socks on. Because, we've been so regimented. I used to get up and wear our 16th century uniform every day, woolen breeches. And it's
Oh, you had that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Wasn't very comfortable. And I realized as well, it was only later on that it was only washed once a year, I think, our coats, and our breeches was once every 12 weeks. We really
Well, it's
smart.
terrible self-care we learn at those places, and especially if you're a bit of a rebel like me, it's like we had to make the bed every day with hospital corners, and
Mhm.
so I left school and I thought I'll never make the bed again. So it meant I slept in rubbish beds, or felt entitled to have my girlfriends or wives doing it for me.
Mm, 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 mm.
So yeah, so so consciously going into a life where there's more self-care, I think is also important. Yeah.
Mm, thank you. Thank you. Anything else for thriving? What else do
Well,
we
I
do?
sometimes say to people, if you've got someone who loves you in your life, having led perhaps quite a cut-off life, maybe workaholism, maybe other addictions or something like that, you're incredibly fortunate.
Mm, mm,
So really value that, because boarding school syndrome is really it's a wound of love. The love is cut off.
mm,
And if you've got someone in your life, really to cherish that.
mm. Yeah. Interesting. I think it was in your book and Joy's book, talk about this idea of this carapace, building this psychological wall up. I started doing a practice with my clients a few years ago, is actually imagining opening the wall up and
Yeah.
allowing your loved ones in.
Yeah.
And so many people would be in tears. It would be like, oh my God, I realized I put everyone, because in these schools,
Yeah.
we didn't have any safety, any space. So the only way to do it was to build up this
Yeah.
carapace.
Yeah.
But we still got it up now. And we wonder why we have no friends. We have
Yeah.
no,
It keeps you safe, but it keeps love out.
yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, I've written loads of notes on the side, but I think for me, I guess one of the things I'd love to finish with is just control, and seeing society at the moment. We seem to be, there's more control, and I'm kind of wondering how much that is linked in with the schools and the systems, which is filtered down from the top, that these places have been so controlled. And rather than say in more indigenous societies where there are rules, but there's so much freedom. I'd love you to talk a little bit about that, you know, what can we do if we notice ourselves that, oh, I'm actually really controlling in my relationship with my kids, with work? How do I move from surviving?
Well, I mean, yeah, control's a complex word, but you, I think what you're talking about is that when the survival personality is still dominating your relationships, then you are still playing for safety. And intimate relationships, uh, and I'm talking, I mean, being in a couple or being a parent is the same, involves voluntarily going into vulnerability. And that means you're not playing it, you're actually not playing it so safe. Even with a child, and no, you have a position of authority as a parent, but actually, you know, you're exposing your vulnerabilities all the time, especially when the child is going into teenage life. It gets much more complicated. Um, uh, Setting boundaries and freedom and being compared and being open about your own experiences and stuff like that. Um, and people who went to boarding school didn't experience their parenting like that, because it was sort of, the parenting was subbed out to somebody else, so it becomes difficult parenting. So um, allowing yourself to really experiment with vulnerability, coming out and experiment, and recognizing, having some ability to internally scan and recognizing when you are feeling the urge to play it safe is very, very good retraining.
Mhm.
Uh, and um, and being able to acknowledge things. And if somebody accuses somebody you of something, rather than go back in defense, you might say, "Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you know." stopping that whole defensive competition stuff that you learn in these hyper rational schools is um, which they I mean their paradigm of the sort of cut off hyper rational post industrial human being that people thought is needed, and actually that's got us to a whole lot of a mess, and uh, we can only learn to do it differently one by one, individually.
As we start to wrap up, thank you, Nick. Vision. What is your vision moving forward? Your positive vision for society, so regarding these schools?
Oh, well, I think I certainly have hope that um, the parents themselves will get sort of more psychologically informed and not want to send their children away, actually realizing parenting is good for you. Yeah. And that the people as a whole will get more psychologically informed and realize that actually voting for people who have um, you know just talk the talk but don't walk the walk, like this kind of leaders we've had recently who are churned out of certain schools, is not a good idea. Um, and that we realize that um, being a top-down society hasn't got us very far, and that actually we might want to rebuild our society in, and create, a little bit more like a European society, which is more built from the bottom up. So there's not so much class distinction because class is still massive. Class, I would say, arguably is a bigger thing than race in Britain at the moment. And societies don't have to work like that. Lots of European societies don't. I mean, there's always rich and poor, blah, blah, blah. But the class division, which is really fed by the sort of private school system, particularly the boarding school system, um, is not doing us a service. And I want people to see that and turn away from it.
Mm, thank you. Thank you, Nick. So, how do people find out more about workshops? When's your next one?
Oh well, we start I think third week in September, sort of back to school time. Good time to come on board in school survivors workshop.
And that men and women, or just the men's one?
We went together, and then I think the beginning of October is a woman's one, and then they both have about 6 weeks gap in between, and after that we start again in the spring.
Great, great, great. Well, thank you so much for your time and your
Yeah,
work. It's a real pleasure to speak to you again. I know we only spoke 2 weeks ago, but lovely to speak to you again.
yeah,
And
thank you, Piers. That's great.
yeah, really great. Thank you, Nick. Take care.
Great.
Bye bye.